because such walls are all over the city during the Renaissance, and before and after it, hundreds and thousands of women were put away as nuns. So forget about the beauty of convents and start to imagine the isolation, the indoctrination, the incarceration. The statistics just make your eyes water. By the end of the 16th century, such was the price of the wedding dowry in Italy, by which you married off your daughter into a good family, which was that most families with any pretensions to breeding could only marry one child off, right? One female child. No birth control, people are surviving longer. They cannot live on their own because post-menstruation they become temptation, thank you Eve, right? So if you cannot find them a flesh and blood husband, they have to be married to Jesus Christ. Historians now estimate that something like half of all well-bred women spent their lives in convents. If you are sitting next to a woman, it's one of you, right? It goes without saying, though they all believe in God, there is no other game in town, they do not all have vocations. So who were they, all these women? What did they do? How did they cope? Well, some of them were the obvious rejects, the unmarriageable, the cleft palates, the extra fingers or toes, manner of birthing defects during this period of time. People are ugly as well as beautiful in this time. It's fascinating. Or maybe you're the pretty child who at 10 has a dose of the smallpox, which disfigures you totally. Maybe it's more subtle things. Maybe you suffer from depression or melancholy, even slight psychosis. Galileo had 2 illegitimate daughters. The elder one was put into the convent with the younger one because the younger one was suffering from melancholy and couldn't look after herself. But they're not all damaged goods, right? Some of them are just born at the wrong time. Too many pregnancies, too many daughters. The church isn't interested in those stories, not interested in their cries of injustice. Women are biologically and spiritually inferior to men, and they're the source of temptation. They need to be controlled. Their sexuality needs to be hidden. If they're not owned by convents, by husbands, they have to be behind the wall. And once they're inside the wall, they're no longer individuals, right? The church doesn't record their lives, it only records their death. Here's a few. She died a true virgin. She was a pure bride of Christ. She expired like an angel after communion. She looked after the sick, even those with stenches of sores, which she kissed and contracted, of the illness of which she died. Well, possibly, but what about all the other 50 years before then, right? So how were you going to write a novel about what was essentially hidden history? Well, once again, some of it fell into my lap. I'm here to tell you that if I was trying to write this novel 35 years ago when I was studying history here, I wouldn't have been able to do it because the sources weren't open to me. But once again, once we've started digging deeper into the archive, once we've that real revolution of feminism, which was not just about recreating our present, but was also bringing to life our past, had done analysis of church records, of convent chronicles, tranches of family letters, and bits of serendipitous personal history, and you start to hear the voices slipping out. This is a 15th century poem. My mother wanted me to become a nun to fatten the dowry of my sister, and to obey my mother I became one. Yet the first night I spent in my cell, I heard my lover's voice down below. I rushed down and tried to open the door, but the mother abbess caught me. Tell me, little sister, she said, do you have a fever or are you in love? 16th century letter to the local bishop. Many of us are shut up against our will and deprived of all contact with the outside world. Living with such strictness and abandoned by everyone, we have only hell in this world and the next. Or this from Galileo's daughter to her father. I hope to be excused for dashing off my last 2 letters so randomly, but truly I have been half beside myself in terror because of our novice mistress, who, overpowered by one of those moods of hers, tried twice in recent days to kill herself. The first time she struck her head and face against the ground with such force that she became monstrously deformed. The second time she stabbed herself 13 times, leaving 2 wounds in the throat, 2 in her stomach, and the others in her abdomen. She is now tied to her bed, albeit with the same deliriums, and we continue to live in fear of some new outburst. But ironically, of course, exactly this isolation from men also gave some women great freedom. And that is one of the other things that the researchers started to throw up. Abbesses, who I suspect had the equivalent of power of, forgive me, Patricia, the principle of a good women's republic like Newnham, had the ability to be a patron, to bring in builders, to envisage new buildings, to actually be running a republic of women, women as patrons. No woman gets into Vasari's Lives of the Artists, but there were women inside who were illustrating manuscripts. Some were actually doing miniatures. Some of those manuscripts were sold, actually, or given as presents into the papacy. A very few, were artists, and thanks to the historians, we now have their names. There were ones running the herb gardens and the infirmaries, doing the work of what would have been doctors, which, of course, they would never have been allowed to do outside. There were ones writing plays. We have the manuscripts now of plays that were written by nuns and samizdated throughout Italy. And I was very struck when Claire talked about working in the archives last night and the moments of excitement. And I have a friend who works in the archives on Nuns Chronicles and talks about being in the Vatican archive when he suddenly hears somebody going, "Holy shit!" because they found something they didn't know was there in a bundle of letters that hasn't come out for 500 years. And it's the words of a woman's voice coming back to them. And probably most important of all was music. 8 hours a day, singing. We now know that these women were not only adapting the polyphony of Palestrina and Rore for their own voices, they were playing instruments in orchestras, and some of the nuns were composing. I have a website, and if you go to the website, you will hear some of the music, because one of the people I researched this book with was an early music group who's found the music, who's adapted it for female voices, and sings what they believe would have been coming out of these women's voices. And such was the power of the voices that people came from all over Italy to hear them, to hear the voices of these sweet virgin angels behind the grills, right? You didn't want to go behind the grills because they didn't look so sweet, and not even all of them were virgins, but that's another novel, right? Okay. So all of this I found in the history books. What was much harder to find was anything in art, okay? I've just told you that what painters really like is gorgeous women, right? Well, they're not that interested in women who shave their heads and put on wimples and wear long clothes. So the image of the nun is more or less the same. You have it in your mind. I don't need to show it to you at all. There is one area, because they are, of course, fascinated by nuns. When I was writing this book, when men asked me, "What are you writing about?" and I said, "Oh, I'm writing a book entirely set in a convent," the men would all go, "Oh, naughty nuns, eh?" And the women would go, "Entirely set in a convent, my God, no men. So they must have had a lot of free time. What did they do? What were they creating?" Well, so the thing that men were interested in, of course, was a version of women as ecstatic. Okay? This is probably the greatest representation of art. It's old, it's younger than the Renaissance, but you will recognize it immediately. The Sublime Hand of Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, right? I have a lot of trouble with this. If you look at it, what have you got here? This is a religious moment of tremendous personal, powerful faith of St. Teresa. I think you've got something that looks very like a seduction by Cupid, okay? The angel even looks like Cupid. Look at that cute little vision on its face, right? And when you look at her face, what you have is the carnal meets the spiritual. It is not a surprise that one of the most famous comments from this about this sculpture comes from a French aristocrat who came and saw it about 30 years after it was done and said, "Well, if this is spiritual ecstasy, then I have had it." But as so often happens with creativity and writing, the fact that this wasn't honest, the fact that this was obvious, the fact that this was male, meant that I had to go back and think even more deeply about what were then the images. What was it then that women saw and related to in convents? And of course, I think that there is something very powerful going on in convents, which is profoundly to do with art, and it's profoundly to do with one portrait, one figure, probably the most famous, and possibly until David Beckham, the most famous male portrait of them all. Because alongside their father confessor, who tended to the women's religious needs, there was one man in there with them, their husband. And by this time, he was looking rather more flesh and blood. Jesus Christ. In the stark environment of a convent where there would have been precious other kinds of decorations, certainly not secular stuff, Christ would have been everywhere in the lives of these women. His face would probably be more familiar than their own. This is Donatello's beautiful face of Christ. And it is interesting because at this time, people believed that they knew exactly what Christ looked like. There was a letter from a centurion in Jerusalem, which was later proved to be a fake, but which described Christ. So every single image of Christ that you see during this time is more or less the same figure. This comes later, but it's so brilliant, I have to show it to you. It's a line drawing, and do you see, it is literally a line drawing. That is how the drawing is made up. It's by Claude Mellon, and this is the figure of Christ as we all think about him and know him. The hair divided, the beautiful nose, the regular features, the small beard, etc., etc. They would have known that face, but of course they would have also known that body. I started to realise that with that face and that body so prominent in the lives of these women, there was something quite subtle potentially going on here, mixing spirituality and exoticism. I want you to forget you've ever heard the word Freud at this moment. He's not helpful to you here. It's much more complex than that, right? These girls of 13 or 14 are coming in during menstruation, right? Green sickness is what Shakespeare calls it. Stroppy teenagers is what we call it now, right? Hormones. They're coming in, they are encouraged to think of Christ as their husband. Their initiation service is like a wedding, right? There are hosts of ecstatic writings about Christ as the lover of the soul, but also in some ways the lover of the body. And what's amazing about this moment in the Renaissance, of course, that's been going on for years and years, is that more than any other time he looks like a real man. He's 33 years old when he dies on the cross. He has what is probably the perfect male body. And it looks real because people have been doing dissections on male bodies. From Michelangelo's 15-year-old, which you can now see on the cross as the sweetest, I didn't bother with him, there'd be too many slides, sweetest young body, through to men of 30 dissected so they could get the body of Christ right, okay? And Christ is now, therefore, no longer just an emasculated figure or an emaciated figure. He's quite chunky and hunky. This is Titian, right? What's so interesting about the Christ that these women would have been with is unlike also their fathers or their brothers. This is a very masculine period, and it's a violent and brutal period when they would have been figures of authority, probably bullies and tough. This man both has masculinity, but he also has something else. Oh, isn't this an astonishing painting? You can't believe this. This is 1490s. It looks like a surrealist painting to me, right? It's Bramante. This is Christ off the cross. Look at this man. Look at this man. This is a man who understands suffering, a man of sorrow acquainted with grief. This is a man who knows what it's like not to have power, to be oppressed, to be abused, that nobody listens to, that is incarcerated. He is a tender figure. There is something in this profound masculinity that also needs to be comforted. It needs to be nurtured, to be loved as well as it may be loving you.